the heat in my parents' house was always too high in winter. My mother ran the thermostat at 24 degrees because she said anything less made her joints ache, and the rest of us just sweated quietly and said nothing. That's actually a pretty good summary of how I grew up, hot, uncomfortable, and silent about it. I was 31 when my father told me to get out. Not in a quiet way, not in a sit-down let's talk way. He said it at the dinner table on a Tuesday in February, while my younger sister sat across from me picking at her pasta and pretending she hadn't heard any of the argument that had been building for 3 weeks. He put his fork down, looked at the wall instead of at me, and said, "You should find somewhere else to stay. Meredith needs the space." Meredith is my sister, she's 24. She had just moved back from Vancouver after a relationship ended, and apparently the solution to that heartbreak was my bedroom. The one I'd lived in for most of my life. The one I'd come back to 18 months earlier after my own lease ended while I was in the middle of building something I wasn't ready to explain to anyone in that house. I said, "I'm sorry?" My father said, "You heard me." My mother was cutting her chicken. She didn't look up. Here's what they didn't know about me. I had $2.3 million sitting in a business account under a holding company I'd registered in Ontario 3 years earlier. I had a second account, personal, with just over $400,000 in it. I drove a 2009 Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper, and I bought my groceries at No Frills, and I'd been sleeping in my childhood bedroom for a year and a half. Not because I couldn't afford not to clean, but because the work I was doing required 18-hour days, and I hadn't wanted to spend mental energy on leases and furniture and setting up a new life somewhere, while I was in the middle of closing the most important deal of my career. They thought I was broke. I had never corrected them. My father had a specific number in his head for what I was worth. He'd decided on it years ago, around the time I graduated from university with a degree in computer science and turned down a job at a bank to do something online, which was how he described it for the next decade regardless of what I actually told him. The number he'd settled on was somewhere around $42,000 a year, which was, coincidentally, exactly what my older cousin made working in insurance. And my father respected my cousin enormously. I did not make $42,000 a year. I had not made anything close to that since I was 25. But I'd learned early that explaining money to my father was like explaining color to someone who'd decided they were colorblind. He'd nod, then later say something that made clear he hadn't absorbed a single word. So I stopped explaining. I kept the dented car. I kept buying the store brand cereal. I kept my mouth shut, and I saved, and I built. And I came home 18 months ago because my mother had a minor cardiac event and I felt guilty, and because the office I was subletting had a mold problem, and because, honestly, I was tired and it seemed like the practical thing to do for a few months. A few months became 18. That's what guilt does. When my father told me to leave, something settled in me. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity. The kind you get when something you've been dreading finally happens and you realize the dread was worse than the thing itself. I said, "Okay." I went upstairs and started packing. My mother came to the doorway of my bedroom about 20 minutes later. She stood there watching me fold things into a duffel bag and she said, "You don't have to make it dramatic." I looked at her. "I'm not. I'm packing. Your father just thinks Meredith needs more stability right now." "I know. You've always been the strong one. You've always been able to manage. I've heard this my whole life. The strong one, the capable one. The one who doesn't need things." It started after I had a seizure when I was 6 years old. A febrile seizure, the kind that looks terrifying but is actually quite common in young children. I don't remember it. What I do remember is that for years afterward, my father had a way of referring to that hospital visit that made it sound like something I had done to the family. That whole ordeal, he'd call it, what we went through. I was 6. I had a fever. But somewhere in his accounting of family history, it had become a debt I owed. I zipped up the duffel bag and carried it downstairs. The only moment that actually stung was when I went to grab my laptop bag from the front closet where I'd left it that morning, and found it was gone. I checked the coat hooks, the shelf, the floor. Not there. I went back upstairs and checked my room. Not there either. I went to the kitchen and asked my mother where my bag was. She got very busy wiping down the counter. I haven't seen it. I stood there for a moment. The laptop in that bag had my entire business on it. Not the data, which was backed up 3 ways, but the physical machine I used for everything. It also had a small notebook with handwritten notes I kept out of habit, a portable hard drive, and about $800 in cash I'd folded into the inner pocket because I'd been meaning to deposit it and kept forgetting. I said very calmly, "Mom, where is my bag? Your father might have moved it." "To where?" Silence. I walked to the garage. My father was in there, not doing anything in particular, just standing near his workbench the way he sometimes did when he wanted to seem occupied. I asked him about the bag. He said he hadn't touched it. I asked him twice more. He told me to lower my voice. I left. I sat in my Civic in the driveway for a minute with the engine off, thinking. Then I took out my phone and opened the Find My app because my laptop was on my Apple account and I'd turned on location services. The little dot pulsed on the screen. It was not in the house. It was about 4 blocks away at an address I didn't recognize. I sat with that for a moment. Then I started the car and drove to a hotel. Not a cheap one, not this time. I'd been economizing out of habit for so long that it took a conscious effort to type hotel downtown into my phone and book a room that cost $260 a night without wincing. I had earned the right to not wince. I booked it for 2 weeks. The room was quiet. The thermostat was mine to control. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my work laptop, the one I kept in my car, the backup I'd never mentioned to anyone, and I started making calls. The first call was to my lawyer. Her name is Sandra, and she has been my lawyer since I was 27 and made my first significant business deal. And she has the kind of voice that makes you feel like everything is going to be handled correctly. I told her what had happened, including the laptop. She told me to file a police report that evening, which I did. The officer I spoke to was polite and a little skeptical until I showed him the Find My location on my phone, at which point he became more interested. The bag was recovered the next morning. It had been taken to a pawn shop. I don't know who made that decision. I have not asked, because I have made a choice not to know things that would only hurt me without being useful. The laptop was still there, unsold. I showed the person behind the counter my ID and the serial number on my phone, and they gave it back to me. And I stood in the parking lot in -11 degrees holding it and breathing. My father called that afternoon, not to apologize. To tell me he'd heard from the police. His voice had a texture I hadn't heard before. Something tightly controlled, like a person who has realized they may have miscalculated. I let the call go to voicemail. Then I called a real estate agent. Her name is Greta, and I'd worked with her briefly on a commercial property 2 years earlier, and I trusted her judgment. I told her I was looking for a single-family home in a specific neighborhood. The neighborhood where I grew up, where my parents' house was. I told her my budget was somewhere between $900,000 and $1.2 million. I told her I wanted to move fast. She was quiet for a beat and then she said, "Okay, I'll start pulling listings." Here's the thing about the neighborhood I grew up in. It's not flashy, but it's stable. Solid brick houses, big lots, mature trees. The kind of place where people live for 30 years and then their kids take over the mortgage. My parents' house had been in my father's family since the 1980s. It was fully paid off. He was very proud of that. Greta found me a house 3 streets over from my parents within 4 days. 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, detached garage, finished basement. The previous owners had updated the kitchen and both bathrooms in the last 5 years. It was listed at $1.1 million, and it had been sitting for about 6 weeks because the market had softened slightly and the sellers were motivated. I offered $1,040,000. They accepted. I did not tell my parents. I moved in on a Thursday in March. I hired movers, an actual moving company, the kind that wraps your furniture in blankets. And I spent that first night sitting on the kitchen floor, eating takeout pho from a place on the main street, because my table hadn't been assembled yet. And I remember feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something close to peace. My sister called me on a Sunday, about 3 weeks after I'd moved. She said she'd heard from a neighbor that I'd bought a house nearby. I don't know how the neighbor knew. Small neighborhoods talk. She said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "Tell you what? That you had money. All this time, we thought." She stopped. "I know what you thought. Dad's really upset. I imagine. He says you deceived us." I thought about that word for a moment. Deceived. I thought about the bag at the pawn shop. I thought about 18 months of cooking my own food and keeping my mouth shut and driving the dented car while quietly building something real. I thought about being 6 years old in a hospital bed and spending the next 25 years being reminded that I had cost the family something by being sick. I said, I didn't deceive anyone. I just didn't explain myself. That's the same thing. It really isn't. My mother called that evening. She had clearly been coached or had spent the day working herself up because her voice had a particular quality it got when she was performing distress rather than feeling it. She said she couldn't believe I had kept something like this from them, that it felt like a betrayal, that families were supposed to be honest with each other. I listened for about 4 minutes. Then I said, "Mom, your husband told me to go live in the streets so Meredith could have my bedroom. I would like you to understand that before we have a conversation about honesty." She said that wasn't what had happened. I said, "I was there." The thing about the loan didn't come out until later. About 5 weeks after I moved in, Sandra called me. She had been doing some quiet digging, as Sandra sometimes does when she thinks something is off, and she had found something. My father, about 8 months before all of this, had applied for a home equity line of credit on the family house. In the application, in the section about household income, he had listed me as a dependent earner and had listed my income at $200,000 annually. I had never given him that information. I had never made that claim to anyone in my family. I had no idea where he'd gotten that number, except that it was a round number that sounded substantial but not unbelievable. The kind of number someone makes up when they're trying to make something work on paper. The line of credit had been approved for $180,000. He'd drawn on about $90,000 of it. Sandra told me what this was called: mortgage fraud. The inclusion of false income information on a federally regulated loan application. She told me what the consequences could be. I sat with that information for a long time. I want to be clear about something. I did not report my father to the bank or to anyone else. I am telling you this, not because I want credit for restraint, but because I think it's important that you understand the full picture. What I did was ask Sandra to send a letter, a quiet, professional letter, to my father and his lawyer, outlining what she had found and noting that the information had been identified. The letter did not make demands. It did not threaten anything explicitly. It simply documented what existed. My father's lawyer called Sandra 2 days later. There were some conversations. I was not directly involved in most of them. What I know is that the line of credit was closed. The money that had been drawn was repaid. My father, to his credit in a very limited sense, did not try to argue that he hadn't done it. He called me once during this period. It was late, which told me he'd been thinking about it all day and finally couldn't help himself. His voice was different from any version of it I'd heard before, smaller. He said, "I didn't think you'd find out." I said, "I know I wasn't trying to hurt you." I said, "I know that too. We didn't know what you had. We didn't know what you were doing. You didn't ask." Silence on the line. Outside my kitchen window, a streetlight was doing its thing over the snow. I'd put up curtains the week before, dark green linen ones I'd chosen myself, and I liked how they looked in the evenings. "I didn't know how to ask," he said finally. "It might be the most honest thing my father has ever said to me. I've turned it over a lot since then. I don't think he meant it as an apology. He's not a person who apologizes easily or naturally, but there was something in it that felt true in a way a lot of his words don't." I said, "I know." Then I said goodnight and I went to bed. Spring came slowly this year, the way it always does in Ontario. A few warm days in March that get your hopes up, then more snow, then finally something shifts in the air in April and you can feel the ground deciding to thaw. I planted some things in the backyard. I don't really know how to garden, but I bought some seed packets and a bag of soil from the hardware store on the main street and I tried. The tomatoes are doing something, the herbs are doing less. My sister came over once, in April, unannounced. She stood on the front step with a Tim Hortons coffee in each hand and a look on her face like she wasn't sure what kind of reception she was going to get. I let her in. We sat at my kitchen table, the one I'd finally assembled, and she looked around at the house and said, "It's really nice." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I didn't know. I need you to know I didn't know about the loan thing. I believe you. And the bedroom? I didn't ask for your room. That was Dad's idea. I know that too." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I don't understand why you stayed so long, if you had all this." I thought about how to answer that. The truth is complicated, and the parts of it that are simple I've already told you. Guilt, exhaustion, the mold in the old office, the convenient inertia of a life that was working even if the container for it was bad. But there's another part that's harder to say, which is that I think I stayed because I kept waiting for something to shift. For someone to look at me and see me, not the liability, Not the capable one. Not the strong one. Just me at a dinner table, existing without being in debt to anyone. That didn't happen. I'm not sure it was ever going to. What happened instead was my father told me to go live in the streets, and I went, and I bought the house, and I planted some tomatoes. My parents have not visited, I'm not expecting them to, not yet. Maybe not ever. My father has a rigidity in him that I've accepted as permanent. My mother might come eventually. She called last week about something else, a recipe she said she was looking for, and at the end of the call she said, "Your father is proud of you, you know. He just doesn't know how to say it." I didn't know what to do with that, so I just said, "Okay, Mom," and we moved on. I don't need the pride. I'm not saying that to sound cold. I'm saying it because I spent a long time needing things from people who didn't have them to give, and learning to stop needing them has been its own kind of work. The kind that doesn't show up on a balance sheet. On a Tuesday evening in May, I sat in my backyard with a glass of wine and looked at what I'd built. Not the house. The house is just a house, bricks and drywall and a kitchen I liked and curtains I'd chosen. I mean the whole thing. The company, the accounts, the work that had kept me going through 18 months of sweating quietly in a too-hot house and coming home late and leaving early and never explaining myself to anyone. It was warm enough that night to sit outside without a jacket, just barely. The kind of evening you get a few times a year in this country where the temperature is exactly right. And everything is still. And you feel for a moment like the whole complicated machinery of your life has paused just long enough for you to see it clearly. I poured the last of the wine and I thought, I did that. Not to them. Not despite them. Just, I did that. It was mine. It had always been mine and it still was. The tomatoes was going to need water in the morning. I went inside and set an alarm.